and welcome to Distillations. I'm Lisa Berry Drago. So, we've spent this long, dark winter working hard on our next season, and we're getting really excited to share it with you. One reason? Because it has nothing to do with COVID. Well, hardly anything. Now, it's not going to be ready for another few months, but in the meantime, we have a treat for you.
Hi, I'm Wendy Zukerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show where we pit facts against fads.
Our producers, Mariel and Rigo, interviewed Wendy Zukerman, host and executive producer of one of our favorite podcasts, Science Versus. They talked about the challenges of pivoting to COVID reporting and why it's so important for Science Versus to tell history of science stories.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start where I think probably everyone starts, but we can't resist, with the fact that in October of 2019, you produced an episode called Pandemic with 3 exclamation points.
On today's show, pandemic. If a new and deadly disease was spreading around the globe today, how bad could it really get?
So my question is, are you psychic? Did you bring this on?
Yeah, very bizarre. It was very, very bizarre. And, looking back and thinking back about why we did that episode, and because we for those who haven't listened, we turned it into basically a fictionalized pandemic and asked what would happen if a pandemic started in the modern world, borrowing a lot of what now so many of us know as like the 1918 flu and what happened in that situation. And the reason that and that was very unusual for us. We'd never created a fictionalized version of science before. We thought it would be kind of fun, kind of contagion with citations. And the reason that we did it was because we thought, how else are we going to make people care about the science of pandemics if we don't do this? Because it just feels so out of our world. Like back in 2019, the idea of social distancing, or that you wouldn't be able to go into work because of a virus, like as if we're going to make people care about that and tell them crazy stories about how in 1918 the trolleys didn't work or whatever it was. You know what I mean? It felt like, how can we make people care about herd immunity? And we thought this is how we'll do it. And then, so even that just feels so bizarre now, because all of these things are so incredibly relevant to our lives, so much so that they've just become, we have shorthand for them. In Australia, it's now called, ISO instead of, isolation. And, it's bizarre.
Yeah. And it's funny, you called up this guy that was not a household name yet or again.
We called up the guy.
I'm one of the people. I wouldn't say the guy.
This humble fella is Dr. Anthony Fauci.
And then, of course, you had to call him up again when the actual pandemic was taking off. What was it like? Like, what did we not hear on tape when you called him back up?
Yeah, so I guess it was only 3 months later then. And one of the reasons that we did a coronavirus episode in January, when it was just in people's ears, I remember it was so new that when we were thinking of what to call the episode, I asked the team, should we have coronavirus in the title? Because do people know what that is? And my editor was like, yeah, I think that's becoming known enough now in America, because it was still just sort of just so new. And one of the reasons we did that episode and did it so early was because we had produced this quite horrifying fictionalized account of a pandemic, and I wanted to tell the audience, this isn't that. This isn't that. And so when we were talking to Fauci, that was kind of the background I gave him. I was like, well, remember this episode, and I should say that our fictionalized version, the death toll was much higher. It was a much more deadly virus than the coronavirus we're dealing with now. Mm-hmm. So it was a worst case, but I remember there was a lot of, when setting up that call, I was like, we just need a quick chat just so Anthony can tell us that like this isn't what we told you 3 months ago. We're going to be fine. And then we got on the call with him and he said,
Wendy, I love you. You're wonderful, but I'm telling you 6 different ways we cannot predict. We can't. This is an evolving situation. It could go either way. It could taper out like SARS, or it could take off in a very, very widespread way. And that's the truth.
And I will never forget when we got off that call and me and Meryl Horn, who was producing the episode, just looked at each other and were just thinking, oh, that wasn't the angle. That's not what we thought. So much of Science Versus is fighting against fear-mongering. It's the kind of anti-fear-mongering show. And so the last thing we wanted to do was make people afraid when they didn't need to be. But then to have him say, we very well may need to be scared, was a definite turning point.
Yeah. So you were supposed to be on a break producing your next completely unrelated season. And you say that to listeners, and then you come back for this one episode. And then I see in March, you're like, we're moving on. You can listen to Sanjay Gupta. But then like the next week, you're in your kitchen unpacking all of these chickpeas.
This is Wendy here from Science Versus. I am now working from home, and my package of food for the pandemic has just arrived. All right, let's open it up. Wow, it's a lot of cans of chickpeas.
It just was such a great illustration of like the moment. Like I think we all kind of had a version of that moment.
I know, because we released a trailer, I think, saying like all the fun we're going to have this season and all the topics we're going to cover, and then none of that happened. And we just threw everything out and did whatever it was, 20 episodes about the coronavirus.
Yeah. So what was it, a slow dawning? Did you suddenly realize that was happening?
It was a slow dawning, even though we had done the episode, even though Anthony Fauci had told us we don't know which way this is going to go. The most recent examples of outbreaks that we had, so SARS, MERS, did not become, even Ebola to some extent, did not become these nightmare scenarios that when you watch the news clips of those original outbreaks, there is a lot of this could become the worst pandemic. And, there was a lot of fear mongering, and then it didn't. China was able to control SARS. MERS didn't become this pandemic situation we're in now, neither did Ebola. Because there was a case where there was an Ebola patient in the United States. So, so it just felt like all these modern examples of outbreaks were contained. So I kept thinking this one will be contained. And China did this, what Fauci, I remember called, did this very dramatic action. And in retrospect, that really should have been a sign to me. And it was, but I guess I was still so much in denial. The fact that China acted was so strong once they acted really should have been a wake-up call to everyone to say, why on earth would a country halt their economy if they weren't so worried about what was going on? And that should have been more of a wake-up call than it was. But much like you, I mean, I think we did one episode about once we started realizing we were going to have to focus on the coronavirus more. I remember we did a couple of interviews about what social distancing was and what we now needed to do. And I remember the weekend before we were then asked to work from home. So it would have been around mid-March. And there was one weekend where I felt like I think the whole team felt like we knew what hadn't dawned on a lot of people yet. But it was really only, and then I feel like it slowly dawned on everyone over that week. But I definitely remember walking around New York and hearing people. Everyone was talking about the coronavirus and the pandemic. It was very filmic almost. But I remember people making fun of social distancing, like hearing, because at that point I was already like 6 feet apart, 6 feet apart. And I remember hearing someone say, "Oh, social distancing." It was like, it was at that. And because New York was really about to get quite scary soon after that.
Right.
And so we didn't have much, much knowledge ahead of everyone else. But I do remember that weird weekend.
Yeah. And then what was it like as things started unfolding and almost like exactly mirroring that pandemic episode? Like not taking the subway anymore.
Having academics, literally parrot in some cases what we had written was very odd. And I think if we hadn't been working so hard, I think I would have been incredibly upset by it. But I think we were just, because there were a few moments where, particularly I remember when there was Vincent Racaniello, who's a virologist, when we were talking about the strategy of closing borders. And then he said, it's already here, which was exactly what our fictionalized epidemiologist had said then 4 months before. That just hit me in the guts, and I could have just curled up in a ball in that very moment. And then, but we had to make the episode and make another one and make another one and make another. So I was like, okay, off we go. So I think it could have been upsetting, but instead it was just like, okay, that's weird. We just keep reading science now.
And so you basically had to pivot to basically doing breaking news, which is very different from what your shows are typically like, right? Like I understand they take a couple months to produce. How did you shift to that? And what did you have to change and sacrifice?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Usually it takes 2 to 3 months to be producing episodes. I mean, we're on a break now, so we're produced, but the episodes I'm making now will come out in March or April. And it's very nice. We do a lot of research. Most of that time is spent doing research and talking to academics. And so to flip to the news cycle meant that instead of one producer, so I'm leading, and then we have this amazing team, and each of them have their own baby episodes that they produce. But instead, it would be the entire team basically producing each episode as we went. And then as things moved forward, we were able to kind of create a little bit more of a process. But just at the beginning, when we were all just getting used to what was going on, everyone was helping to research episodes as they were coming out in 2 days, 3 days. And I think what helped was the fact that there wasn't that much that was known about the coronavirus. So for example, when we did an episode about exercise and what it's good for and what it's not good for. And, that has been researched for decades and decades. And so to get across that body of research takes 2 months. But the coronavirus had, we just got the genetic code in January. So we couldn't have had that much research on it. And so a lot of the research that we did end up doing was trying to look at comparable viruses, what makes sense, what doesn't. But it did help, the fact that there just wasn't that much to be reading. And then what was also kind of very new about this pandemic was the fact that scientific literature was getting put out so incredibly quickly. I mean, we could not have made this episode if academics didn't start putting things up on preprint before they were peer reviewed, which did come with its pros and cons, and it meant we had to be super careful about using that research. But because the bread and butter of our show is research, like if we didn't have anything to go on and we just had doctors that we were interviewing on the ground, which we did when we didn't have research that we could rely on, it would have been impossible to make the show. We probably wouldn't have made as many episodes as we did. So there was a lot of things that were changing. But from a kind of nerdy podcast narrative process perspective, what I did realize about when you pivot to the news is it does have some advantages in that you don't need to work so hard to make people care about a topic. So a lot of what we spend time on after we've done all of our research, when say we're doing an episode about it, whether it's exercise or I'm researching one right now, which is very interesting, on anti-venom, on snake bites. And there's a lot of work that then goes into making an audience care about that, particularly now when, it's just coronavirus day in, day out. And so that takes a lot of like narrative work. How do you do that? But whereas in the middle of a pandemic, when everyone cares so much about the coronavirus, when everyone, particularly at the beginning, when you didn't have the fatigue you have now, when people really wanted to know, how should I go to the supermarket? Do I need to wear a mask? Is this virus airborne, quote unquote? All you needed to do was ask the question, and it was like, yes, I'm in, and that's the answer. I want to know the answer. I don't need, a song and dance to get me interested in this.
Yeah, it's like critical information.
Yes, news you could use, and it's
exactly.
So at its core, Science Versus is about, debunking faulty science, separating fact from fiction, truth from conspiracy theory, perhaps, and obviously, COVID is full of that. So like your show was almost made for this moment, but at the same time, some of the myths that are circulating are like too ridiculous. Like there's not, it's not like, does CBD really work for X? And you can really dig into that. Like you don't have to dig very far to learn that injecting ourselves with bleach is never a good idea. So how do you navigate, how have you navigated that when talking about COVID?
Yeah, I think we kind of developed, once it became clear, which it became clear pretty quickly, that there was going to be a lot of guff coming out, a lot of nonsense. We really had to triage what was going to be important enough that we tackled. And we kind of had a couple of different tests for that. One was, can we add anything new? Because when the bleach thing came out, every news site, even Fox News was like, don't drink bleach. So at that point, we can't beat the news cycle, quote unquote, but also there's no need, even though we're pumping these episodes out quickly, we can't write them as quickly as a online, written piece. But there was no need to set up an episode to tell people really the intricacies of exactly what bleach will do to your body if you drink it. Whereas hydroxychloroquine was a different story. So that, because particularly at the beginning, it kind of became a catch cry of ridiculousness. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there was genuine interest in whether this could work. And there were good quality clinical trials that were done based on what the very early, I shouldn't call them results, but sort of anecdotes of what doctors were seeing in China. Because, at the beginning of the pandemic, doctors in Wuhan, just didn't have any information, to desperately trying to help these patients, trying whatever they had on the shelf. This malaria drug showed some promise. And I remember reading like a very early article that was just basically we are, it was very quickly written. We are seeing some good news with this. Some patients seem to be doing well. And so there was interest. And then, of course, Donald Trump said some nonsense about, said it was God's gift. Then it became madness. But amidst that, scientists were genuinely trying to work out if it worked, and then we found out from very good clinical trials that it didn't. But that was an example of something where we thought, no, actually, let's find out what is going on here, because there's more to it than simply this is rubbish, particularly at the time we didn't know if it was rubbish or not. So there was a couple of, of steps. And one that was really tricky for us was whether we were going to tackle, did it escape from the lab? There were a lot of debates in the team about whether that was just a racist political plot point and whether we should be tackling it. But then the reason that we did in the end was we realized how popular it had become and how many people did think that this was either intentionally or accidentally released in a lab. And on top of that, we realized that from a very nerdy perspective, the science of how scientists know or do you think very readily this was not made in a lab. They know it wasn't made in a lab. The science of that and the genetics of how they can analyze a virus and see that was super interesting and not something I was reading elsewhere. So then that became enough to tackle that episode.
Yeah, to add something. So all along, you've had these recurring segments that are completely unrelated to coronavirus. Like, I think there's one about, like, why does grass smell nice after the rain? Whose idea was that, and why did you decide to have that?
I think that was my idea, the NCVCs, the non-coronavirus content. And that was because we all needed a coronavirus break, basically. And we thought if we did, our audience did. And we enjoyed so much just the mental break of beautiful, quirky science. It's such a joy. Our intern at the time, Sindhuja Srinivasan, she kind of became the lead producer of those segments, and it was just such a joy to read the scripts and edit them, and we got such lovely feedback from our listeners, and I think there was just so much coronavirus content, particularly in the months. I mean, there is still. Who am I kidding? That reminder that there is still beauty in the world and science is still doing weird things. It's not all serious. Was just something that we felt we needed.
Yeah. So the history of Science Versus has done like a few episodes on history of science, and they kind of stray away from the regular formula of debunking science or debunking faulty science. How do episodes like this differ from regular episodes for your team? And basically, why are you doing them?
Yeah, so they are really different for our team. We've done a few of them now. I think we do them for a bunch of reasons. These are episodes that we are genuinely interested in. But there's other reasons. I think the story of Science Versus, we obviously love science. It is what I hope will drive the world and the way that we create policy in the future and think about things. I think, trying to be more rational and evidence-based has just helped me live my life and be a happier person ultimately. But having said that, science does not have a wonderful history in many respects. It's messed up many things. The science of gender, the science of race. And so I think it's important for us to say that and to acknowledge that, like, yes, this, when done well, science is wonderful, but when done awful, it's extremely powerful and can be extremely dangerous. And so those, just telling people that, or if we'd had an episode on like how science has mucked up things, it can feel a little teachery, a little tut. But if you tell that through a story, it can be much more powerful. So it's I guess it's our way of nodding to that. And I mean, sometimes we do just say science really messed this up. We did that in the transgender episode. We did that in the race episode. But the stories help us kind of tackle that in a different way.
Yeah, like a Science Rotten Underbelly was about how medical experiments done in prisons and in Philadelphia, and how like that was actually the standard for testing products in prisons, and how they were kind of great places to do that because they were in a controlled setting basically. And that kind of hurts trust that people have in science. I'm wondering how that lack of trust is applied today. Like, what role does people's trust in science have in understanding science today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of like what is science. So I guess, when I say I love science or whatever it is, whatever nerd thing I said, I guess I mean the scientific process of having an idea about something and then testing it with objectivity, so that if your experiment fails, you publish that hopefully, and then we move on. But of course, as you say, in history, too often the things that people were testing, there was not objectivity. There was ideas about how the world works embedded within them. That I've mentioned gender and race, but just to focus on gender for a second, we have countless examples of saying things like, men evolved for this and women evolved for this. And if you look at the animal queendom, look at all these examples of these male species doing this thing and female species doing this thing. And now we have more women doing evolutionary biology and going, wait a second, there's a female spider that will eat the male, after they've had sex. Oh, hold on a moment. Like, there's a female bird over there doing this thing that we didn't think females did, so it's just, and that really reduces your faith in science when you hear that, because these are narratives that have stuck around and people still say today. And it is a problem. And I suppose I just hope that people can separate out the two, the fact that, yes, science messes up and we need to be aware of that, but that doesn't mean the whole scientific process is not the way to go, and instead you should rely on your intuition and truthiness, because I do still think that these days science is getting it right more often than it's getting it wrong, and it has baggage that we need to be aware of. But I still think the world would be a better place if we trusted the science, even if it messes up a little, rather than whatever we're trusting now to get us through the day.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Good luck on your next season. I hope that it's somewhat of an escape from everything you've been working on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Distillations. Stay tuned for updates on our coming season. And remember, Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine. You can find our videos, stories, and every single podcast at distillations.org. And you'll also find podcast transcripts and show notes. You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and everything else going on in our museum, our library, and research center. The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give now. For Distillations, I'm Lisa Berry Drago. Thanks for listening.